This is Climate Watch. I'm Zhao Ying. Welcome to the show. Europe has set a target to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 90% by 2040 compared to 1990 levels. The goal is now legally binding after the European Council formally adopted the amended European climate law last month. It is designed as an intermediate milestone toward the EU's objective of achieving climate neutrality by 2050. But the law also allows for some flexibility. For example, from 2036 onward, member states will be allowed to use international carbon credits to account for up to 5% of their emissions reductions. The deal also delays the full implementation of the EU's new emissions trading system for road transport, buildings, and other sectors by 1 year to 2028. So how achievable is this new target? What does it mean for Europe and beyond? And how might it reshape global industries and trade? For more, we are joined by Dr. Niklas Höhne, co-founder of the NewClimate Institute, a think tank based in Germany. Dr. Höhne, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So before this amendment, the EU had targets for 2030 and 2050, but not a clear milestone in between. So how important is this 2040 target for closing that gap?
Yeah, people they always want to plan short ahead, so it's very important to have milestones. The 2050 target of climate neutrality is so far away that it gives a direction but doesn't give certainty, and that's why it was very important to set an interim target. It's also important for the Paris Agreement, where there is the obligation to provide a target for 2035, and that was now only possible after the EU has adopted a 2040 target.
Yeah, but the law now aims at 90% emission reduction by 2040 compared to 1990 levels. I mean, that's quite an ambitious target. From your perspective, how achievable is that?
I think it is achievable if one plans ahead. And that's the important part of this target. If you know where you need to go, then it is achievable. And the EU was actually on a good way of getting there. Already now, with the currently implemented policies, EU is getting close to that target. So I think it is definitely achievable, but it will not come by itself. No, the EU has to implement policies and make no mistakes on the way. So it has to implement more renewable energy and move to electrification in transport and buildings and in industry. And with that, it can definitely achieve it, yes.
Okay, but what does it really mean to make this goal legally binding? Like, will there be punishments if countries do not meet that goal by 2040?
Well, Europe has a very complex policy system for climate policy. So, for example, there's the emission trading system for electricity and industry, and that is quite clear. So the companies that are covered, they basically have to comply with the emission reduction targets. So that will definitely happen. And for the other emissions, they are governed by nationals, so by the EU member states. That's for buildings and transport. And also there, if the national governments don't meet the EU level target, they have to pay a fine, or basically they have to buy some allowances from elsewhere. So there's the enforcement within the EU for individual member states is quite strict. So if it's once set, then it's quite likely that it will also be met.
Okay. Well, we know the decision comes at a time when many European industries are under pressure from high energy prices and increasing global competition. So to what extent is this climate target also part of Europe's broader industrial strategy?
Yeah, there's currently a big discussion whether one should relax climate policy and whether that's good for the economy or not. And I think that's not black and white, because the economy doesn't exist. No, if one would do less climate policy and would relax the standards, then one would reward the laggards. One would reward those that have done nothing, and one would punish the frontrunners. And the frontrunners that have invested in renewable energy, that have invested in electric mobility, electric processes in industry and electric heating. And you would basically punish those frontrunners, although they have invested. So that's why it's not black and white that doing less on climate would be good for the economy. That's actually not true. And what is definitely not good for the economy is a back and forth. So first saying you go one way and then turning around going the other way. That is definitely bad because that leads to sunk investments. So I would say that having a straight course toward climate neutrality without detour is probably the best industrial strategy.
Okay, but in the short term, this is very likely to raise energy costs rather than lower them.
That's correct. It will raise energy costs if the energy comes from fossil fuels. It will actually lower the energy costs if the energy comes from renewables. And that's the trick. So the ones that have built their business model on the use of renewable energy or electricity, they have an advantage. And the ones that build their business model on fossil fuels, they indeed have a problem. But they need to change their business activity in the long run anyway. And the longer the wait, the more they will be basically left behind.
Yeah, well, the law actually introduces certain flexibility mechanisms. For example, it allows up to 5% of the target to be met through international carbon credit sharing in 2036. We know that for years, the EU has been skeptical for international offsets. Why this change now?
Yeah, the EU actually has a long history of allowing credits to its system. And at one point, it was a big mistake because the credits that came from the outside were very cheap and they basically destroyed completely the impact of the emission trading system for over 10 years. And that's why the EU had decided not to allow any credits from outside into that system. But it seems now that some have forgotten that mistake, and the push again for allowing these credits has been very high. I think because some of the industry think, okay, if we can't meet our targets, we need a safety valve, we need something to achieve the targets, even if we think we cannot do that alone and with own emission reductions. So that seems to be the idea. But in the end, I think the compromise will not do that because in the compromise that has been decided, only high quality credits would be allowed into the system. And the higher the quality, the higher the price. So it's not a given that these credits that will be allowed into the system are actually cheap. And that's why it's a bit questionable whether that the hope that some had that this is a safety valve, that will really happen.
Yeah, but what do you mean by high quality projects, high quality, credit? Because we know that currently, for instance, clean cooking projects, they kind of dominate the carbon credit market. But this has also been quite controversial because people warn that emissions reductions may be overstated. So how serious are these concerns?
Well, if one takes the Paris Agreement literally, then it says that any those kind of activities should raise ambition. Yeah, so it should lead to more emission reductions. And if I read that literally, then I would say a clean cooking project, that definitely is not the case because clean cooking, that's straightforward. One has to do that anyway. In many cases, it is profitable anyway. It has so many benefits that it should happen anyway. You should not get credits for doing that. Countries need support sometimes, but it's not something that is then leading to or should be allowed to be used to increase emissions elsewhere. So that's not, I think, a good idea. Mm-hmm. Another problem around these carbon credits is that, as you mentioned, sometimes the emission reductions are overestimated. So we have two problems. One is emission reductions are overestimated, and second, the projects are not really additional, so they would have happened anyway. So there is the risk that a lot of cheap credits enter the system. And that's why some in the EU that were part of the negotiations have said not all credits will be allowed into the system, and there should be clear safeguards that they are really additional and really of high ambition and not overstating the emission reductions. And the question now is, will they be able to set up rules to avoid these things from happening? Or will the market pressure be so high that the rules will be very weak? And that's something that is still to be decided.
Okay, but given EU's massive emissions baseline, that 5% flexibility could translate into demand for hundreds of billions of tons of carbon credits. So what opportunities does that create for project developers, especially in the global south?
That's indeed the question on what are the criteria for allowing emission reductions into the EU emission trading system or into the EU system as a whole. Yeah, so if only very high quality credits are allowed, then this will be very expensive reductions, and it should be then in areas that that would not happen by themselves in the country. That is, I think, a safe bet. If a project developer does develop something like this, then there's a high likelihood that that will be allowed. If one starts massive project development for clean cooking, for example, I think that will not happen. It will not be a good way forward. I think the one thing that some people in the Global South think this will create a large revenue stream, I'm not so sure whether that will happen. One problem is with the carbon markets that at least half of the money gets lost along the way. Yeah, it never reaches the Global South. It basically is lost by the project developers, the verification, and is lost in trade margins. So if developed countries or the Global North would directly support the Global South, then I think the Global South would have much more benefit for the dollar or the euro spent.
Okay. Well, since at least 85% of emission reductions still must happen within the EU, what kinds of domestic policies or investment will be most critical to achieving that?
Well, the backbone of that transition is renewable energy. Yeah, so expanding solar, expanding wind, onshore and offshore, expanding the grids, having flexibility in the electricity system, storage, these kinds of things. So that's absolutely fundamental. And there one should not do detours. So investments in new fossil fuel infrastructure, new gas pipelines or new gas-fired power plants, that would be the wrong way of doing it. And then in the other sectors, so in transport, industry, and buildings, it's basically electrification, away from fossil fuels towards heat pumps, towards electric cars and trucks, and towards electrification also in industry. I think that's the main thing that needs to happen now. And it's a huge investment, yes, because we have to do everything different than we did in the past. But in the long run, it will pay off. We have seen now with the high fossil fuel prices because of the crisis in Iran, that Europe is very dependent on fossil fuel imports. And that's actually a very dangerous situation.
Okay, but apart from shifting to clean energy, the law also mentions the use of permanent carbon removals for those hard-to-abate sectors like heavy industry and aviation. Are these technologies ready to play a meaningful role?
Well, the first question is, what are hard-to-abate sectors? And I think 10 years ago, we thought steel, for example, is a hard-to-abate sector. And now we know there's already steel plants running on hydrogen. So there is technology developed to make this possible. So that's really good. But there are still maybe some areas where it will be very, very difficult. So aviation is maybe one. But who knows? Anyway, carbon storage is something very expensive, and we don't have much space to store the carbon underground. So you should use it very sensibly. Definitely not for fossil fuels. So, for example, carbon capture and storage with a fossil fuel gas-fired power plant. That is not a good idea because it's very expensive and not really working. People tried it, but it doesn't really work. If we use the carbon removal, then to basically take CO2 out of the atmosphere, and that can be done by, for example, technological solutions with taking CO2 out of the atmosphere with direct air capture and then storing underground. That again is very expensive, and we should only use it when really, really necessary.
Yeah, and some actually worry that relying too heavily on these carbon removal technologies could slow down the efforts to cut emissions at the source. I mean, how are policymakers going to strike that right balance?
I think the trick here is to keep them separate, to set a target for emission reductions and set a target for removals and keep the two things separate and not mix them together. Sometimes in target setting, they are mixed together also within the EU right now. But the way to ensure that one is not stopping the other from happening is by keeping them separate.
Mm-hmm. Well, also the law emphasizes on social fairness, energy security, and affordability. How can the EU ensure that households and vulnerable communities are not disproportionately affected by the transition?
I think that's a very, very important point because the energy transition will only happen if the population is supporting it. And there it's very important to take the vulnerable communities, the parts of the population to bring them along. And that's actually what the EU has thought about. So there will be an additional carbon price for fuels for heating and transport. And that will particularly be difficult for the populations that have less resources. And there the EU is thinking about how to deal with that matter and help those vulnerable communities to not be as much as affected and basically put the major burden on those that can afford it.
Could ambitious climate laws like this risk fueling political backlash, especially in countries that depend heavily on carbon-intensive industries?
Well, there's two things. One is about jobs, and if you have this transition, then the governments really have to take care that the jobs that are lost in one industry are overcompensated by new jobs in new industries. That's possible if you have a long-term view, if you really think, okay, this is what needs to change and plan accordingly. That's good. But the other element is that the energy prices and the costs of living are very important, in particular for the poorer population. And there it's very important to make smart policies to help the poorer population and not put a major burden on them. And that's something that I think the policymakers in all EU countries have now understood.
Okay, but we know that Europe is currently calling for energy independence or strategic autonomy. Does that mean an extra burden for consumers? Because, for instance, we know China is currently a global low-cost leader in these clean energy technologies like solar panels. But if Europe pursues greater strategic autonomy and limits China's imports, what would that mean for ordinary Europeans?
Well, first of all, EU is part of a global market, and currently Europe is very dependent on fossil fuel imports. Yeah, so this is a strain, and we see right now with the crisis in Iran that the gas prices have doubled, that oil and gas or petrol prices are rocket high. So it's really difficult for consumers right now, and pursuing renewable energy would be a way to get independent of these price volatilities. Yeah? So it would be a clear advantage. Now the question is, where does it come from? So most of the solar modules are coming from China, indeed. And if Europe would restart its production, then it could be a bit more expensive. That's true. For wind, it's a bit different. There's still a lot of wind manufacturing in Europe, and one would have to then support the European industry. And in comparison to China, yes, for Europe, that would be a bit more expensive. But I think the turmoil in the global economy has shown that being a little bit more independent would definitely be good in the long run, so that one is not vulnerable to price shocks, either on the green market or even on the fossil fuels.
Okay. And also in this law, there's decision to delay the new carbon market for buildings and transport for a year to 2028. And that's clearly a move to protect citizens from rising costs. But does this delay also send a mixed signal to the automotive and construction industries?
Indeed, that I think is a difficult thing, because carbon pricing, so putting a price on carbon, only works if it's reliable. Yeah, if you know how much gas or petrol will cost in the future, you will today buy the right car or the right heating system. And if this is unreliable, then the signal doesn't work anymore. And this is what happened here. The start of this extra levy, so to say, was postponed, and that again punishes those that have thought of this and have been the front runners, and it basically rewards the laggards. And I think that is really a very difficult situation. I think the better thing would have been to keep it where it is and to help the poor population to cope with the problems.
Okay. And also, as Europe raises its climate ambition, exporters selling into EU may face higher carbon requirements. So, how might this affect the manufacturers in countries like China, India, or Southeast Asia?
Yeah, that's, I think, an important part of the EU policy that one has understood that, okay, if in Europe the production goes climate neutral, then one has to ensure that anything that's imported into the EU has the same conditions. And that's now implemented as a policy. And I think that's an opportunity for the countries that are exporting, because if you're faster with the transition and if you're the first one to be able to export to the EU green products, then you will get a higher market share of what you can sell into the EU. So I think I would rather see it as an opportunity for those that do the transition faster. They can then have access to a larger market.
Yeah, but even for those who are transitioning faster, the EU is increasingly using tools like the carbon border adjustment mechanism to protect its own industries during this transition. So, with the 2040 target being so ambitious, is there a risk that this could be seen as green protectionism? And how can Europe avoid triggering trade tensions with major economies like China or the US?
Yeah, the EU is very careful so that this carbon border adjustment mechanism is in line with international trade regulations. So that's very important to the EU. And again, it is trying to say that this is a support mechanism to transform the world into the carbon neutral production system. I think one way that the EU could do it as well is it could actually offer help to countries that want to import into the EU. So some of the revenues that are generated with this carbon border adjustment mechanism could be used to help those countries that import into the EU to make the transition a bit faster. And I think that would be a good move. It is currently discussed by some in the EU. That has not been part of any decision, but I would think that that would be actually a good way forward.
Yeah, so I mean, with this 2040 target, the EU is also sending a strong signal globally. So, how might this influence other major emitters in shaping their own climate commitments?
I think it does already shape other major emitters' climate commitments, or at least climate actions. We've just said those countries that import into the EU, they already now think about carbon pricing. They think about how to transform, how to comply with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, how to be able to import into the EU. So we see that in many countries that the climate policy of the EU has already an impact on other countries. And I think that's an important part. I think climate change is a global issue. We need to do it together, but it always needs front runners to make others move. And I think EU here with its climate policy for climate neutrality by 2050 and this very comprehensive policy framework is a front runner, and with that is moving others in the same direction.
Okay. Well, actually, as Europe moving towards this 90% emission reduction target, China has just released its goal in its 15th five-year plan, and it aims to reduce carbon intensity by 17% by 2035. So, I mean, do you see opportunities to better align these two long-term climate pathways, or do you think we're moving towards more competition?
Well, I think the US under President Trump has taken a complete different path. Yeah, the US is now supporting fossil fuels and doesn't think about the transition towards renewables. And in that situation, it's time for new alliances so that countries come together that have the same interests. And I think here there's a clear interest between the EU and China to go along the same way. I mean, China has seen that renewable energy, electric mobilities, batteries, all of that seems to be a business opportunity for China. And China has now global leadership in all of these technologies. So a clear interest that the transition is happening. And the EU also has a clear interest that the transition is happening because it's totally dependent on fossil fuel imports that come from regions which they cannot influence. So both countries have clear common interests, and that's why I think it's a huge opportunity now that the world is reshuffled a little bit to find new alliances how to do this.
Okay, Dr. Niklas Höhne, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And that wraps up this edition of Climate Watch. You can find more episodes on your favorite podcast platforms. Just search for Climate Watch and hit subscribe. Don't forget to leave us a quick review or share it with a friend. You can also email us at radio@cgtn.com with your questions or feedback. And stay updated on the latest climate stories with our Substack newsletter, Climate Choices. I'm Zhao Ying. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time.